Welcome back. This is episode 5, and we have covered a lot of ground in the 4 episodes so far. If you feel like we've been rushing through a lot of these topics, the honest answer is that we kind of have. These are all very, very broad subjects, and we want to give everybody watching this a decent introduction, but not to overlabour the point to people switching off or becoming bored with the content. So to that end, we're going to approach today's subject in a similar manner. I've said this before, that we aim to be as non-polarising as possible. I think this might be our most divisive episode yet, but I'll let you judge that in the comments at a later date. So, in the neoliberalism video, we talked about the society we currently live in, and we talked about some of the problems of basing a societal construct on individualism and individualist goals. Given that we've already talked about that, and we've also talked about how to change that society in the last video, should we wish to. What's the other option on the table? Is there another way to base a society? Well, yes. In the same way that neoliberalism is individualism made flesh, we could take collectivism as a goal and construct a society based on those principles. Well, let's consider for a moment what that society might have as its, let's say, 2 core tenets, right? Firstly, that we would take collective responsibility for the welfare of everyone. Now, do you remember in the Nations video when we talked about maximisation of welfare and how we might achieve that? A collectivist society would have all of us taking a portion of the responsibility for everybody else's welfare. Not complete responsibility, it's not like you're personally going to be held to account if somebody is defrauded or receives poor healthcare, but a belief that everyone is responsible, at least in part, for everybody else. Now, that principle is one that we live all the time. Even right now, there's been a huge groundswell of support of people taking collectivist action into their own hands. They've looked after neighbours or vulnerable people. They've run fuel, food and equipment to NHS workers since the start of this pandemic. In fact, the popular response has, in a lot of cases, drowned out the state's response to this pandemic. So that's people taking collectivist action without any societal construct to encourage it. The second tenet, which is a bit more controversial, it's a lot more controversial, is that of collective ownership of productive capacity. So that's a big sentence, I admit. Collective ownership basically just means that, we're all in part responsible for the productive capacity of our nation, basically our output, our ability to produce, our economy, if you will. Now, often when you say this to people, the immediate reaction is, well, businesses should still be able to exist, profits, free markets, and other things. Buzzwords that they've read in the media largely. And you can still have companies and free markets and all the rest of it, but let's consider what, as a society, we really need. Healthcare, food, housing, water, electric, the stuff that, on a day-to-day basis, everybody needs to get by. Those things should be considered collective ownership. Now, this isn't a new idea, it's been used in the UK for decades. We have less of it now than we used to because we sold, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of it off to private companies who managed it all perfectly. Especially the trains. But they did that based on neoliberalist ideology in the 80s, and we are now forced to consider whether or not that was the right thing to do. Because before that, those companies, those organisations, were beholden to the people. In the same way that democracy creates a government that's beholden to the governed, public ownership of services creates a system where that service is beholden to its users, not its shareholders. Now, there are plenty of arguments in economics, or plenty of economists, who would argue that this is always doomed to fail and is a woefully inefficient way of providing services. And, I would agree with that, were we not able to point at some staggeringly efficient ways that we have provided public goods to people for generations. If you look at the education and the health service in the UK, even after 10 years of what could politely be called neglect, it's still rated as some of the best in the world, compared to, the free market system of the United States, which I'm sure you're all so well aware of its problems by this point in the pandemic. The other thing that public ownership allows us to achieve is to reinvest those profits, the excess wealth of those services, back into the service themselves 100% of the time. Now, in the UK at the minute, about 60% of all investment comes from withheld profits. So that's not something the private sector doesn't do, but there's still a chunk of money that's squirreled away to shareholders' pockets and is never seen by the public again. Now, you could argue that goes into a bank who then reinvests it, but we've just said that 60% of investment comes from withheld profits, so are those banks really investing it or not? You only need to look at Thomas Cook, for example, who recently went into administration and then shut down, stranding lots of people abroad because they allegedly ran out of money due to cash flow. And yet their shareholders have been paid a large sum of money in dividends the year before, as if the company was doing fine. It wasn't. They've known for a long while it wasn't. Those dividends shouldn't have been paid. If it was publicly owned, then those dividends would never have been paid. They would have constantly been used to improve and add to the service provided. Now, that is not the right solution for everything. I will go on record and say this now. Under a collectivist system, we're not saying that businesses should not exist. It's just that key services, things that are necessary, should be owned by everyone. Companies, however, are free to provide wants while the state provides needs. You want a nice car? Sure, go buy one. There will be a company building them somewhere. Because the public own most of our key services, we don't have to pay as much for them because we're not having to pay for those profits to be squirreled away into a shareholder's bank account. That frees up a lot of disposable income for your average person, and they can afford more luxuries, which then means that the private sector, which would be providing those luxuries, is going to boom as well. Now, we accept that under capitalism, and I apologise, this video has got to be economics heavy, and I'm sorry, but we accept under capitalism that there is a cycle from boom to bust. You'll have heard this. You've got peaks and troughs of economic growth, and about every 10 to 15 years, we're going to hit a point where we're at the peak and we go, hey, we've got money to spend, yeah, it's great. Quote Gordon Brown, we have brought an end to boom and bust. And then something like 2008 or 2020 happens and, the economy nosedives. And that brings about huge amounts of hardship for people, naturally, because the people squeezed most in those times are the people who've had the least for the last few years. Thus, you have mass unemployment, mass underemployment. This was a feature of the recent recovery from the 2008 financial crash. This causes huge problems for a society. More importantly, it causes huge problems for people who suffer as a result of it. Now, you must be thinking, well, surely there's something we can do about that, right? And there is. Economists have things called automatic stabilizers. Now, they are policies which limit how much boom and bust we can possibly get through. They kind of like squeeze that wavelength, if you will, of economic growth. So sure, your rich times aren't going to be as rich, but your bad times aren't going to be anywhere near as bad. Now that sounds great, right? Like surely we should have more of these policies in place. Well, the best example of an automatic stabiliser is a strong taxation and welfare state. One that says, okay, after you've earned a certain amount of cash here, you're not going to earn much more because you have more money than you will ever need. And if you are struggling, don't worry, you'll be provided for. The reason for this is that people with less money tend to want to spend the money they're given. They need to, basically. If you fall on hard times and can still spend some money, even if it's money provided to you by a benefit system, then you are still contributing to the overall demand of the economy. And thus, the economy doesn't suffer so badly. It moderates that downward swing of the curve. That's all they are. They just limit that wavelength and stop the peaks and troughs being quite as extreme. That's a lot, and I'm sorry, but I've kind of got to explain automatic stabilizers. But I asked a second ago why we don't have more of those, and the biggest reason is corporate greed. The issue with automatic stabilizers from a corporate point of view is that when the times are good, they can't just take money out of their businesses as a free-for-all because there's taxes on doing that, or there are maybe taxes on how much they can earn in dividends. That means that, yes, it limits the boom of the economy in order to pay to make the busts less bad, but corporations don't like it. Specifically, shareholders in corporations don't like it, and they have a lot of control in a neoliberalist society. Now, this control is often exercised by influencing public opinion. How many scare stories or horror stories have we read in the news about, benefit fraud and health tourists to the NHS? That was the big one a few years ago. Now, when you ever interrogate those figures, they are astronomically low. They are so disappointingly minute in terms of the actual damage that those things do to our economy. And the money we spend hunting those discrepancies often costs us more than the benefits or the health itself, which is the greatest exercise in futility I've ever heard. But it does an important thing. It serves the purpose of turning public opinion away from those people and onto the side of the shareholders. Now, when people talk about collectivist systems, often their first argument against it is that they say, oh, well, people would lack an incentive to innovate and grow. Without free reign of how much you can earn or be paid or getting bonuses at the end of the year when you've just tanked your company, people won't develop or improve. But that's not true, by and large, because we're not talking about removing the ability to earn more. It's just moderating how much more can feasibly be earned. If I were to say to you, the most money you're ever going to earn in your life is £99 million, would you take that deal? Would you be happy with £99 million a year? Of course you would. Nobody needs more money than that reason. And that's just an arbitrary figure I pulled out of the air, but there must be a threshold at which humans don't really need anything more in terms of cash. And why not set that threshold as law? Call it a super wealth tax, if you will. But for that tax and that super wealthy, what do we use it for? Well, we use it, going back to the tenets that we talked about earlier, to ensure that welfare for everyone, a basic level of living that is acceptable to all. That idea of an upper limit of earning is incredibly controversial and has caught a lot of heat in recent years from the press. Another interesting feature of the negative media surrounding these policies is that they rely heavily on public misunderstanding of how big some of these figures are. We see it in the news all the time. £1 billion, £10 billion has been thrown around by this country or that country. And rarely do we ever sit and think how much that money is in real terms, how it compares to your average person. And I'm telling you now, £99 million is a colossal sum of money for one human to have access to. There's not much you couldn't do with that amount of money. Now, the other interesting thing is that when you explain these policies to people, when you say, well, let's ensure a basic level of living for everyone and maybe limit how much corporate greed there can be in the world and how much vested interest those shareholders exhibit in our society as a whole, most people nod their heads and say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Well, why don't we do it then? Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And then you say, hey, that's socialism. And all of a sudden, they panic. What I've just spent the last, I'm not quite sure how long, describing to you is socialism in a very, very bare and basic format. But it is. It's democratic socialism. Now, we have lots of examples in history of non-democratic socialism. And the popular opinion is that because it shares a name, it has to be the same thing. That's not true, right? We accept that that's not true in plenty of other aspects of our society. But in this, the popular opinion, the dominant media opinion, is that, democratic socialism that ensures a strong welfare state and a decent taxation system equals Stalinist Russia and starving 1 million people. Why? Well, there's a whole interesting history about sort of Cold War propaganda in the West and Reaganism and Thatcherism and stuff, which we haven't got the time for today. But realistically, it's done because the people controlling the information that you read and the people controlling governments to whom you are beholden don't like the idea of things being a bit more equal. Because again, if you limit how much the wibbly line wibbles, shareholders, companies, and let's call them power brokers, can't cream that amount of cash off the top at the peak of that curve in order to limit how bad it is in the troughs. That's it. That's the video on socialism. People will watch this, I am sure, and follow it along for a while and then think, oh, that was too extreme. I don't agree with that. That's fine. My role here isn't to convince you to agree with anything, but I do think it's important that as educated, intelligent individuals of a society, we are aware of all of the options on a table when deciding what sort of society we want. Now, we might want to take items from socialism and items from neoliberalism and kind of marry them together, and that's what plenty of people have done in the past reasonably successfully. But until you explain them in their purest forms, I think it's difficult to understand where those policies come from. The National Health Service is a socialist principle. Say what you will about everything else in the UK, the NHS is socialist. Has been since it started. And I think we can all broadly agree that right now, the NHS is the best thing about living in the UK. And so if it works there, is it too much of a stretch to imagine it working elsewhere? I hope you've enjoyed this. It, more than any other, this video has kept me up at night wondering how I'm going to present this information, and I hope I've done it in a way that isn't too preachy. I'm not sure, but we'll see. The next video, episode 6, is going to be a bit different. It's going to be a chance to have a bit of a wrap-up of the first 5 episodes because we've covered a lot of ground, and man, sometimes you need a break. And also to answer any questions that people have got. So if you do have any questions about what we've talked about so far, drop them in the comments or send it to our Twitter account at Jimdustries. We've got that now. If we see it in time for the next video, and it's not too inappropriate, we'll answer it. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and wherever you are in the world, stay safe. Oh, the weather's still nice.